Welcome back everybody to Propositional Logic. In the previous lesson, what we did was take a very basic introduction to the subject itself, looking at what propositions are within the context of propositional logic, and just introducing the logical connectives that we have. This lesson is going to go into more detail and explain exactly what the connectives are and how they work, and define them from the perspective of logic. So let's just remember back to the previous lesson. We have connectives, logical connectives, and there are 5 of them. We have the negation, we have the conjunction, we have the disjunction, we have the material implication, and then we have the material equivalence. Okay. Just like that. These are the 5 logical connectives that we're going to be concerning ourselves with. And in reality, when we think about propositional logic, we only really concern ourselves with 4 of the 5. This last one here, material equivalence, isn't really utilized that often. We tend to focus a little bit more on these ones, and we actually focus a lot of our attention in philosophy to this one, the material implication, and we'll see why as time goes on. But let's define these then. How can we define what they are? Well, we can define them with reference to what they do to the proposition themselves, how they transform a proposition, or at least how they transform our understanding of a proposition within a sentence, okay? So let's begin with the concept of the negation. So the negation right here, a negation essentially does what it says on the tin, the word negate. It negates the proposition, okay? A negation is applied to a single proposition or to a bracketed single sub-sentence, which you could have, but for the most part, you would define it as in reference to a single proposition. So whereas a proposition like here, like the letter P, just in and of its own, just sat in a sentence, would be true. Okay, the representation of P suggests that the proposition itself is true. The negation of P, the negation of it, takes it and falsifies it. It makes it false. So if I have a negation symbol here, I've got this in front of this proposition P, what I'm saying is not P. It is not the case that P is true. Remember, this is what propositional logic is attempting for us to understand, the truth value of various different propositions. So assuming that P is true, then the negation of P will have to be false. And this is how we define what the negation property is. So if we just take a generic proposition P or a generic proposition A, like so, we will say that the negation of A, this sentence here, this little bit here, okay, is true. This is true. The negation is true if and only if A on its own is false. That is the definition of the negation in propositional logic. It is telling us that the negation of A is only true. This thing here can only ever be true if and only if the A on its own is false. If A is false, then not A is true. If not A is false, then A is true. That's how it works. It is almost the inverse in terms of truth value for these 2 propositions. So if you ever see a negation in a sentence, you're basically saying it is not the case that this proposition is true. So not P, for example, is how I would say it as we go on. Okay. So that's what a negation does. What about the next one? What about a conjunction? Let's come down here a little bit. What about a conjunction? Conjunction. Well, a conjunction is essentially trying to define the relationship between multiple propositions, whereas with a negation you can attach it to a single proposition. We have here not A. With a conjunction, you need to have at least 2 propositions, okay? So it is relational between 2 propositions. What does this mean? So we could write, for example, we could write P and then we could write the conjunction, and then we can write Q. It is relational between these two things. And what this essentially means is the word and. That's how we would translate it into English. This sentence here says P and Q. Okay. More formally, we would say that essentially, in order for the conjunction to be true, in order for us to have a proposition with a conjunction with another proposition, and for this whole thing to be true, for this whole thing in brackets here to be true, it has to be the case that we have P and we have Q. Okay? You have to have both in order for the conjunction to be true, because it's P and Q. So let's define this more properly then. So we would say that A and B is true. Okay, this sentence here, this proposition here, A and B is true if and only if A is true, A on its own is true, and B on its own is true. You have to have them both at the same time. If A is true and B is false, then you cannot have a conjunction. Then A and B does not follow. It does not hold that that is true. And so therefore you don't have a conjunction. That is how we define the next logical connective. We have A and B, or P and Q. Okay? Moving on then to the third one, we have a disjunction. Disjunction. Okay? Similarly to the conjunction, the disjunction is also relational. It talks about the relationship between at least two propositions here, or two subsentences potentially. So we have, for example, P, and then we have the disjunction, then we have Q. Okay? It's just the inverse. It's written in the opposite way to the conjunction. How would we translate this into English? Well, for the most part, we translate this into English as the word or. So what I've written here is P or Q. So whereas the conjunction is P and Q, they both have to be there in order for the proposition to be true. And with a disjunction, we have P or Q, which, as you could probably understand, suggests that we only need to have one of them there in order for the disjunction to be true. And so let's define that as follows. So we have the sentence here, A or B, as written here, is only ever true if and only if we have A, that is true, or we have B, that is true. Okay? This provides the greatest amount of truth value fundamentally between the conjunction and disjunction, because all you need is to have one of these elements to be true, and then the disjunction is true. So if we take this sentence up here, the P or Q, okay, this is true in any circumstance where either one of these are true, or both of them are true. You could have them both being true, and the disjunction could also be true. Okay, so P could be false and Q could be true, and then you would find that the proposition is true. P could be true and Q could be false, and the proposition would still be true. The only time when the disjunction is false is when they are both false. That is the only time that we get the disjunction being false. Moving on then, the fourth one, the material implication, material implication. The material implication, as written here. Well, we have a P, then we have the material implication as written as so, and then we have Q. What does this tell us? Well, the material implication is sometimes defined as, or written as, a conditional. That is sometimes how it is defined in textbooks and stuff. What does this mean? Well, it suggests, therefore, that one proposition is conditional on the other proposition. The truth value of one is conditioned on the truth value of another. In other words, this says, if P, then Q. Okay? If P, then Q. That is what this is telling us. If P is true, then Q has to be true. Okay? The truth value of Q is determined by the truth value of P. So in order to come up with a more formal definition of this, what we do, let me just sort that out. Okay. What we can say is that the proposition here, if A then B, is true. If and only if. Now, this is a bit difficult, okay? Because how do we define this to be the case? If and only if P then Q, or if and only if A then B. That seems a little bit gratuitous, not particularly nice and neat. The way in which we can define the material implication is by defining the inverse of the material implication. So what does this mean? Well, if we have if P then Q, what we're saying here is if P is true, then Q has to be true. That is what we are saying. It couldn't possibly be the case that Q is not true when P is true. And this gives us the definition of the inverse of the material contribution. Okay. Now this tells us, therefore, that the inverse of the material implication is that if P is true and Q is false, then if P then Q doesn't hold, it doesn't follow. So we can write the definition in relation to this inverse, and we can say that if A then B is true, okay, if and only if either A is false, is either A is false or B is true. This is how we define the material implication. This is how we define it, okay? So we are having a situation where it's an either or, okay? The way that it works is the only situation where the material implication is false is where we have a truth value on the part of A and then a false value on the part of B. That would mean that the material implication does not follow. Okay, finally, last but not least, the material equivalence. What does the material equivalence tell us? Well, the material equivalence looks a little bit like this. We have a P, and then we have a sort of double-ended arrow, like so, and then we have a Q. What is this telling us? Well, we've actually been using the material equivalence throughout our definitions here. This little letter here, this sort of double I, this I with a double F, means if and only if, okay? That is how we define the material equivalence. The material equivalence is defined as if and only if. If and only if, so P, if and only if Q. So what does this tell us? Well, it essentially tells us that the truth value of P is connected to the truth value of Q, and the truth value of Q is connected to the truth value of P, such that P is true if and only if Q is true. So it means that they both either have to be true or they could both be false. But as long as they both have the same truth value, they can both either be true or both false. That means that we have a material equivalence. So let's just finally finish off with A, if and only if B is true, if and only if both A and B are true. So A and B are true, or if both A and B are false. And that is the definition of the material equivalence.